How do I begin to talk about Pir Vilayat? It seems like an impossible possibility, to coin one of his phrases, I believe. Pir is an inspirer of my soul. He's like this great cheerleader when I'm with him in retreat. I try so hard for him, for me, for myself. I would come to the tent about 6:15 or so in the morning. Maybe the first session was at 6:30. And I'd sit there and I'd give thanks. I'd give thanks for all the time and all the retreats I'd ever had with Pir Vilayat. And I'd sit and be blessed. He was getting on years. At this point, he was in his mid to late 70s or something, you know. He had had some health problems at times. One of the retreats I remember in particular. So it was not a foregone conclusion that he would be ready for this retreat necessarily. So I would sit there, giving thanks for all I had already received. And if I should receive more, alhamdulillah. If not, I sit in thankfulness. And so Pir would come, I'd watch for him, walking up the pathway. You know, majestic walk. I mean, what's words to describe your Pir, right? I'd watch as he'd take his shoes off, you know. I'd watch his movements. His little bowing as he'd start to curl up in his position. As he'd bow to us gently and then formally. And the first day of a Pir retreat, if there wasn't any preliminary people, you know, doing stuff before, I always thought of 3-day retreats. Anything less than that just didn't seem like a retreat, you know. And I'd try to arrive, if possible, I could maybe a day early, or at least early, you know, just try to get in the movement of it, the flow of it. I would eat very lightly all through the retreat. I'd eat lightly. My body would be a little restless. I mean, my body was never made too well for sitting. I was a bit frog-like, and the way my hips were, and couldn't quite do a cross-legged thing to speak of, but I had little props here and there in different ways of trying to arrange my pillows. But eventually, the body would settle down after a day or two, day and a half. I no longer paid any attention to its complaining. There was a higher order of things happening. I appreciated the body and didn't mistreat it particularly, but it settled down. And it may seem a little too neat and tidy to say my mind settled down, but something like that happened too. Pir would lead me in these intricate explanations and beginnings and futures, and as he'd go through the things, and I'd follow so carefully. And I'd follow, just barely, but I'd follow. I was a physicist, you know, sort of a dropout physicist, but nevertheless a physicist, so I would follow, and eventually my mind would just get, well, it would settle down too. And at that point, you know, it's hard to put in words. I think now, as I look at it, I think of it as presence. My presence. His presence. One presence. And although I have learned particulars from Pir, concepts, particulars, and I gain from times in reading some of his materials that he's put into formal presentation form. But what I seemed to gain most with Pir was this. After a few sessions, and after my body had settled down, and the session would end, and people would busily go about their way, I was still sitting. Holding in my great arms a much greater presence. And I felt like I could sit there forever. And there was always another person doing the same thing in the hall. We'd never look at each other, but the same thing. Words fail to communicate. A word like remembering comes into mind, Remember. No longer is there talk of light bodies and coherence. There's just Pir's presence. There's just my presence. And lest I say, it feels like one presence. So now, as I try to remember Pir, to honor, to follow, to be guided, and he said that once to me. He said, most of my work is done on the inner planes. And that's what he said. This presence, that's the inner planes, as near as I can tell. And so, on my one good knee, at a young 64 years old, I stand, knee bowed, in thy service. in service to thee, thou. Always like that word, thou. You, thee, thou, me, all kind of mixed together. Thou. I, thou. I, thou. When we're lucky, there isn't much I and there isn't much thou. There's just one. So if these are what my Pir Vilayat videotapes are going to be, I will enjoy them immensely.